Okay, so the kind of godfather, if you will, of regulatory liberalism is an economist named John Maynard Keynes. So John Maynard Keynes came to prominence really in 1919 when, as a delegate to the Treaty of Versailles, or a delegate in the British delegation to the Treaty of Versailles, he wrote something called The Economic Consequences of the Peace. Now, you don't need to know too much about this, but it just establishes who John Maynard Keynes was. He's probably arguably the most influential economist in history, certainly the most influential economist of the 20th century. Now, in The Economic Consequences of the Peace, he basically anticipated the Second World War. He said that the Treaty of Versailles was far too harsh. It was going to destroy the German economy, which was ultimately going to destroy the European economy, which wasn't going to be great for the world economy, and all it was going to do was build resentment in Germany, and eventually you'd get the rise of a much more angrier Germany. Well, it turned out he was right. Of course, he predicted the rise of the Nazis. He predicted the economic malaise that happened in the 1920s and the 1930s. And that's sort of where he initially came to prominence. But the other thing that John Maynard Keynes is known for is in 1936, he published a work called The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. And in this, he articulated a theory of political economic governance, which has become known as Keynesianism. Now, in many ways, what he is articulating is very much what Franklin Roosevelt was already doing in the United States with his New Deal coalition, where he was basically... Keynes's idea was when the economy was stagnating and when private business, private capital wasn't producing growth, it wasn't producing enough expansion, the state had to step in because it was the only thing large enough, the only thing powerful enough that could generate demand. And part of how it does this is by running deficits. So the state just starts spending. And then in spending, it creates employment, it creates jobs, particularly with infrastructure that people then start working in, and the state runs deficits. And once the economy gets going again, you pay off those deficits that were run to rebuild the economy. Now, if we look at the next slide, I'll explain this in a bit more detail. And that's essentially what Franklin Roosevelt was doing in the 1930s. Now, the difference was Roosevelt wasn't doing it as much with deficits. He, in many ways, financed this massive state intervention in the economy. As I said last class, he created public works projects like dams, bridges, rebuild roads that employed millions of people. He employed artists, he employed photographers, he employed people to interview ex-slaves. He employed, as I said, photographers to go around the country documenting the Great Depression. You could get federal grants to put on a play. You could get federal grants to make a documentary film. They even had people go into the American South and record blues music and folk music to preserve it for posterity. So the unemployment rate, which peaked at about 25% in 1933-34, started to drop. And by the end of the 30s, Roosevelt had got it down to about 13 or 14%. So there was success to it. Now, the reason it didn't have this dynamic takeoff was partly because Roosevelt financed it through the increasing taxes. And this is a key difference. Keynes said, you don't want to finance this state expansion of the economy with taxes. You want to do it with deficits because you could end up they could end up canceling each other out. And we really see the success of this system in the Second World War. Because if we look at the Second World War takes what Roosevelt is doing with the New Deal state, and it puts it on steroids. It militarizes it. The deficits that the United States government was running during the Second World War were massive. We're talking 60, 70, 80% deficits, almost 100% deficits with the economy, right? So massive deficits that the U.S. ran in the 1940s, which created the most dynamic economic expansion really in the history of the United States, rivaled only by the economic expansion of the 1990s, which we will look at later. So this is a lot of what regulatory liberalism was. It was using the state to stimulate demand in the economy where private business wasn't able to do it. And then slowly, as private business comes back online, the state can take a less active role, but still a much more active role than in classical liberalism in ensuring and regulating and managing capitalism. You could call it a kind of controlled capitalism. What we're seeing is the regulation of business, high wages, high taxes, extensive social programs for all. So these safety nets of the 1930s were dramatically expanded in the 40s and 50s and 60s. Now, from 1945 to 1975, we saw a sustained period of economic success. We saw a massive economic expansion, both in the United States and throughout the rest of the world. As I said last class, the United States rebuilds the economies of Britain, France, Italy, Germany, Austria, Japan, all the countries, the major industrial powers that fought in World War II, the United States finances their rehabilitation and rebuilds them. And this is partly why this period of success happened. I mean, think of how many people it employs to rebuild Europe or rebuild Japan. Millions of people, right? And the United States government was supplying almost unlimited credit or grants in the form of the Marshall Plan in the late 1940s. And what this led to was a rising income across all classes. And you actually saw the highest gains in income amongst the working class, not the wealthiest class. The wealthy class did extremely well. You still had rich people, you still had millionaires, you still had corporations that were being founded, you still had a dynamic form of capitalism and entrepreneurialism. But this period is often what historian Judith Stein refers to as the Great Compression, that inequality in capitalism was reduced to its lowest levels in the 1950s in basically all the major industrial powers, the United States, Canada, France, England, Germany, Japan, Australia, Italy. All of these countries, inequality was the lowest it had really ever been since the dawn of civilization, since the dawn and the emergence of capitalism in the 14 and 1500s, when we got that transition out of feudalism. There has never been a period where you had a more equitable redistribution of resources than the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. You had low inflation, and you had a massive expansion of consumer culture. Remember, a lot of the ways the United States expanded out of the 1940s and helped lift the world into this era of economic growth and prosperity was a further intensification and incorporation of the working class, initially the white working class, into the consumptive aspects of the economy. If you remember from last class, in the 1940s alone, income quadrupled in 4 years, right? Imagine if you knew that in 4 years you'd be making 4 times as much money as you're making now. And this wasn't just people in the professions, this wasn't business people, these were average workers, people working in factories. In 1946, by 1950, were making 4 times what they were making at the end of the Second World War. So you can see why the 1950s are seen as this period of prosperity where many people look back to. And of course, the 1950s had its problems, particularly in the United States. Jim Crow segregation was still there. African Americans lacked the same rights as white Americans. Now, this would change in the 1960s when African American workers were also brought into that consumptive economy in the 1960s. And this incorporation and using and the expansion of the U.S. economy to bring in more of the working class into that consumptive aspect of capitalism helped lift economic prosperity around the world. Americans were buying things made all over the world, whether it be in Germany or Japan or England or France. It created a sustained period of prosperity for really 30 years, from 1945 to 1975. As I said, and material well-being and security. This is the era where you had a job, you probably worked for the same company your whole life. There was no such thing as temporary contract work. The gig economy didn't exist. And one of the key differences, and part of the reason people spent more money, was because if you know you have a job guaranteed for the next couple of years, right, you're more likely to spend. But if you're working on contract, if you know, well, my contract ends in a few months and I don't know what I'm going to do after that, you're not going to spend as much money, right? And it's one of the ways that this kind of gig economy actually limits growth, as we'll talk about when we get more to neoliberalism. But in this period of capitalism, it was high employment, high taxes, high regulation of business. You had sustained economic growth, the rise of income across all classes. As I said, the rising income amongst the working class is where the most success actually occurred. Now, to give you a sense of how high taxes were, in 1960, under a Republican president, the highest tax rate in the United States was 91%. Now, that's marginal tax rate. Now, for those of you that have done your own taxes, you know that you're not paying 90% in taxes. That's not exactly the way it works. And you can look up how progressive marginal tax rates work. So nobody was actually paying that, but that was the highest tax rate you could be taxed. Today, with the combination of federal and state taxes, you're probably talking around 48, 49% for the wealthiest Americans. Now, if you make your money by investing, your capital gains tax is only 15%. Now, in the 1950s and 60s, it was 50%. So again, you can just see how the economy was far more regulated. The other thing you didn't have from really 1932 to 1973-74 was you didn't have economic crises. You didn't have stock market panics. You didn't have stock market crashes, right? If we look at the history of the United States alone, in the period of classical liberalism, right? And that period of capitalism is really defined. Unregulated capitalism is in many ways about the catastrophic up and down of the market. And in the United States, you can see an economic crisis or a financial panic happens about every 10 to 20 years. You get one in 1819, you get one in 1834, you get one in the 1840s, you get one in the late 1850s, you get one in the 1873, 1886, 1893, 1907, 1911, and you also get, of course, the stock market crash of 1929. But from 1930 until 1973, 74, there was no economic up and down. There was no catastrophic financial panic. There was no stock market crash because capitalism was regulated. Those harsher forces of capitalism, that catastrophic up and down was managed so that it wouldn't happen. Now, part of the reason economic elites are okay with this catastrophic up and down is there are ways to make money if you have a lot of it. And if you don't do that well under it, you're just less rich than you used to be. But of course, if you work and are a member of the working class, your life could be ruined in one of these financial panics. And it often happened. And we saw this in the Great Depression of the 1930s. Where people's lives were destroyed, and the contribution of many other factors where people were desperate, and there was really nothing. There was no hope in that early period of the 1930s. But between 1932 and 1973, because of regulated managed capitalism, you didn't have this catastrophic up and down. And in many ways, part of the reason you have all this nostalgia for the 1950s is not the 1950s specifically, but it's for this form of regulated capitalism. Somebody in one of the lecture discussions characterized it as a kind of golden age of capitalism. And in many ways, that's apt. It's the period of capitalism where the most people benefited from the growth that was inherent in capitalism, largely because it was regulated. Now, as we'll see, this system couldn't go on indefinitely. And by the 1970s, and I'll talk about this more in a minute, a crisis emerged in which this form of regulatory capitalism, the balance of global forces that are propping it up, and the policies that were laid in the 1930s and 40s to sustain it, no longer start working because the balance of power, the economic balance of power of the 1940s, is not the same in the 1970s. The world had changed, so you had to find a new balance. And that creates, as we'll see in a minute, an opening for a new system of regulatory, or I should say lack of a regulatory capitalism to emerge in the form of neoliberalism. Before we get there, I'm going to talk briefly about the crisis of the 1970s. So I'll leave it there for now.